You're listening to Mrs. Turner Talks. I'm your host, Sarah, and this show is my story. I am a Christian woman in healing, the wife of a recovering addict and mom to 3 small kids. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about boundaries in marriage and in other relationships. Before we start, healing begins with owning how you feel, so pause for a moment, consider what you're feeling, and write it down. Now, let's get to the show. I'm going to share from my experience in learning and drawing appropriate boundaries in relationships, as well as from my Life Recovery Guide for Spouses, pages 29 to 32. That recovery guide is written by Melissa Haas and edited by Debbie and Mark Lacer. This episode is going to cover what abuse is defined as in the book, and it may bring up triggers or old memories for some. I would also like to add that this is work I did 1.5 years ago. I have grown, but I believe it's infinitely important to not sugarcoat what that growth looks like. It can be a very messy process, and my desire in sharing this is to exemplify Christ and what he does with our pain. Deb shares in a testimony on page 29 that she and her husband began to realize that they couldn't have intimate conversations with their children present or after 10 p.m., or if the conversation carried on and on and on. They began to see a need for boundaries in their recovery. There's a saying, fences make good neighbors, and that is essentially the theme of boundaries throughout the recovery guide. They define boundaries as property lines, limits that show where we begin and end, and delineate also where others begin and end. They assist in learning what is or is not our responsibility. I love the fundamental boundaries of safe relationships that the author shares here. 1, it is never appropriate, except in cases of self-defense, to either hurt your spouse physically or to be hurt by your spouse. And then 2nd, it is never appropriate to abuse another person, verbally, emotionally, or to allow yourself to receive verbal abuse from others. The author defines physical abuse as any physical injury inflicted by someone who is angry or is trying to control another person. Examples include pushing, hitting, slapping, pinching, thumping, punching, burning, cutting, and unnecessary restraining. Where fear is present, intimacy is not possible in any form. Fear takes over, and the emotional, spiritual, or physical intimacy is tainted from that lack of safety. Verbal or emotional abuse is defined as using words or behaviors to inflict wounds on the soul of another person. Examples include name-calling, profanity directed toward another person, threats of physical injury or abandonment, intentionally embarrassing a person in front of others, and hateful or untruthful criticism. Based on these definitions, do you tend to be the abuser or the victim in your marriage? How about with other family members or friends in your circle? If you're seeing any of these behaviors in yourself, your spouse, or others in your life, these relationships need to be reevaluated, and appropriate boundaries must be placed in order for healing to happen. I found looking back that I tended to lack discernment in choosing friends, becoming the victim, because I didn't place appropriate boundaries to protect myself. With my children or people that I viewed as under me, I was the abuser. With kids, they are at a place of learning what safety is, and I realized it was my job to teach them that my behavior was not okay. They shouldn't accept me yelling at them. I began apologizing when I would shout or lose my cool, and teaching them the act of forgiveness while I owned my mistake and asked them for the forgiveness that they so freely offer. Apologizing isn't only an act for the victim, It's naming what's wrong as the abuser as well and giving a point where repentance is possible. When we're stuck in these patterns, it's often really hard to understand that you can choose something different. When you are being abused in some manner, you can choose to walk away from an argument, leave the room, leave the house, go to a friend's house, call the police in cases of physical abuse, call a safe person, which I discussed back in episode 8, asking safe people to grieve with me. I'll have that linked in the show notes if you're interested. Or if you tend to be the abuser violating others' emotional and physical boundaries when you're angry or scared, you have options too. You don't have to fall back into old patterns. Take a time out from the situation. I did this by literally putting myself in timeout on the steps with a feelings chart beside me. Take a walk, call a friend, do something physically active. I washed dishes, or I would scrub something really dirty to get the energy out of my body. You can also find a quiet place to journal about your feelings. And if you choose to journal, try the reflective listening format from Forgiven Much Ministries. I'll have some information linked in the notes about that. The basic format is I feel blank, about blank, because blank. My need is blank, and my next steps are blank. And the idea with this is to name what you're feeling, figure out what you're feeling like that about, and why it made you feel that way. And then you talk about a need to help you get to a regulated state, possibly a physical need, etc. And then your next steps, so you don't stay where you're at. Anger in itself is not a sin. It's what we choose to do with that anger that's often sinful. Maybe raging and breaking things or talking down to someone. Uncontrolled rage often results in huge wounds in our kids' hearts. This was my fear. I didn't want the kids that I so desperately love to fear me in this victimized sense. We're never entitled to sin against others because someone has hurt us. Like I said at the beginning, this process of growth is messy. We aren't healthy the first time we try to break our pattern, but it's a step toward freedom from the bondage that abuse brings. The homework I did for this assignment is largely related to my husband's behavior, because that's what the book suggests you dig into. This assignment, however, gave me really clear vision on so many other situations throughout my life where people crossed lines, violating my physical or emotional safety, or where I crossed lines and caused others to feel or be unsafe. Speaking the truth and confronting unsafe behaviors in yourself or in others is where this conversation is going to start. The goal is to create healthy and lasting relationships and connection, not cutting off the unhealthy relationships. I've done my share of repairing and cutting off. Both are hard, but one ends with true restoration and the other ends with a wound that remains unhealed. I hope this episode has been a help to you. That's where we'll stop for today. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.